Hey folks, I'm just going to quickly go over the second paper topics. I do not seem to have my handy dandy Apple Pencil. I left that at the office. I'm doing this from home, so this is going to be without visual input, but I'm reasonably confident y'all will survive. About topics 1, 3, and 4, I want to say something general first before diving into what's common to each particular topic. Namely, that you need to address the philosopher in question's argument, not just his or her conclusion. So, a number of the critical discussions about topics 1, 3, and 4 simply tried to address reasons for thinking that the Earth moves or doesn't move, depending on which topic you were addressing and how. But that's just addressing the conclusion. When I say is so and so right, I mean is the argument right, not just is the conclusion right. So the way these papers work is you present an argument in some detail, and then you address the argument, not just whether you think that for some other reason the conclusion is a good or a bad one. So a number of intelligent papers, nevertheless, were a little bit misguided because they utterly changed topics, really, since the argument provides the topic. And their critical discussion doesn't engage the argument at all, it just engages the issue that the argument was about. So please keep in mind whether this applies to your paper. All right, topic 1, a petitio principii, I think, though Latin is a dead language, is a begging of the question. So begging the question means assuming what you're trying to show. Why does Salviati think that Simplicio assumes the point at issue? Well, Simplicio argues that if you drop an object from a tower, it will fall straight down from the tower. Grazing is the term they use, which is a slightly misleading translation, it seems to me, since it's not supposed that the object would touch the tower. Whereas if the Earth had been moving, the object would fall at a slant. Simplicio thinks you can see the object doesn't fall at a slant. Salviati shows Simplicio that you can see no such thing because on the broadly Galilean hypothesis that the whole system is moving, they are all moving together. And so there is nothing that we can see that would distinguish between the object falling, in Simplicio's terms, straight down or at a slant. If this seems like a very simple response, it is. It was not supposed to be as hard as some of y'all made it. Some of you brought a whole bunch of bells and whistles in there, but I just wanted you clearly and in your own words to bring out Salviati's point, which most directly stated is that Simplicio begs the question that the whole system is stationary, in thinking that you can observationally tell whether the object falls directly perpendicularly or at a slant. From a certain point of view, it might be falling at a slant, but that point of view would not be that of an observer moving with the Earth. So there are various levels of detail, there are various worries you could have about it. Simplicio could perhaps draw on some resources about natural motion being simple rather than compound. That's not going to get him very far, but that's perhaps your most promising way of responding on Simplicio's behalf to Salviati. I didn't care particularly what you said, but whether it was fair and relevant. All right, turning to the most popular paper topic, which was Descartes' immortal line that nothing can be imagined which is too strange or incredible to have been said by some philosopher. There were a lot of good points made in these papers. There were not a lot of good papers, in part because people just took too many liberties. I do want you to put these arguments in your own words, but I want you to put Descartes' argument in your own words, not whatever Descartes makes you think about. So context here matters. You didn't have to present the preceding context, but you did have to understand the preceding context. In the preceding context, Descartes is saying, I would not have undertaken this seemingly arrogant project of trying to figure out for myself the most fundamental facts of the world if there had been a more modest alternative, if there were people I could look to and trust them to guide me in these matters. I would happily be guided. I am not so arrogant as to think I'm the only one who can figure things out. But in my studies and my travels, I discovered that there's so much disagreement. There's so many strange and incredible views defended by this, that, or the other smart person that there was no way I could have any confidence in trusting the Aristotelians or the Galileans or the Catholics or the Protestants or whomever. And so the worry for Descartes is I don't seem to have any alternative to the seemingly immodest project of trying to figure things out as best I can. And as best I can means going back to the most basic, most fundamental issues and trying to resolve them with certainty. So that's the heart of the Cartesian project there. You need to at least have some sense in your paper that it's a defense of the seeming arrogance, a defense against the charge of seeming arrogance against this project. Many different objections could be lodged against it. Merely because people disagree doesn't mean you can't determine who's got the right argument. That is not obviously a more hopeless or hopeful project than what Descartes resolves to do, which is not rely on anybody at all. Some of you wrote as if the fact of disagreement shows that there's no answer, and that is not just mistaken, it's insane. There may be some views about which there's no answer, but from the fact that some people think the Earth is flat and some think the Earth is round, it does not remotely follow that there's no fact of the matter about the shape of the Earth. So it's a question of getting the argument more or less right and then having a cogent and relatively specific and thoughtful objection. The Kepler topic addresses the objection that objects projected fall vertically back to their places. The more astute of you might recognize this is very similar to the issue that gets discussed in topic 1 by Galileo. So the objection, of course, is the one that if the Earth were moving, then an object thrown up in the air should fall back from the direction of the Earth's rotation rather than straight down. And there's some reason to think objects fall straight down to the extent that Kepler and his contemporaries thought they could experimentally ascertain that. It's useful to bring out the premise behind this objection, namely that all forces are contact forces, that things only move other things by touching them. That's why, if the Earth were still moving and an object loses contact with the Earth, it is thought that it would fall back to a point farther beyond the Earth's rotation. That's the premise that Kepler rejects, and he rejects it by appealing to the only non-contact force with which he and his contemporaries were familiar, namely magnetism. So he posits a kind of magnetic connection between the Earth's atmosphere and objects in the Earth's atmosphere. Many of you brought out points about the circumference of the Earth, or the diameter amounts to the same thing. You need to bring out why that matters. Kepler's point is objects will not get away from the Earth's magnetic grip, as it were, unless they have traveled a significant distance as judged in terms of the Earth's diameter or circumference, depending on how you want to formulate it. So what response might a Ptolemaic thinker in the first decade of the 17th century have had? Well, the most obvious worry is it seems like an arbitrary force to invoke. We don't have any significant evidence that there is a magnetic connection between the Earth and the atmosphere or objects in the atmosphere. So it seems ad hoc. It seems like something added in to help save Kepler's pet theory. On the other hand, Kepler has some responses there because the Aristotelian needs to explain why the Earth's atmosphere remains the Earth's atmosphere, why it doesn't all float off into space given the natural motion of things made out of fire and air. So I, of course, didn't care which side you came down on. I wanted you to get the argument down accurately and have an intelligent discussion about its merits and demerits. Finally, Salviati's seventh objection to the claim that the Earth stands still. Do keep in mind that an objection means an argument, not just a claim. That roughly is that point I made at the beginning here. In philosophy, we're always, always, always in the business of argument evaluation. It's an intriguing claim because it, in a certain sense, turns the Aristotelian position on its head. The Aristotelian position had been, and you can call it the Ptolemaic position if you prefer, How could the Earth possibly be moved given how heavy it is? The heart of the seventh objection is, in a world that is governed by Aristotelian motions, how on earth could the Earth resist being moved? How could it resist being jostled around by the motions of all of these spheres? The details matter, and some of you emphasize different details. Galileo seems to have Salviati claim that the heavenly spheres are much greater than the Earth. That's not a particularly clear formulation. If it means something like volume, Aristotle's certainly going to grant it. If it means something like mass, it's not at all clear that Aristotle would grant that. From the Aristotelian Ptolemaic standpoint, the things in the heavens appear to be ethereal, made of something very light that has the property of moving in perfect circles at uniform speeds. That's another aspect along the lines of which an Aristotelian might respond to Galileo. Galileo seems to be assuming that we're talking about forceful motion in the heavens, that things are moved by being pushed or pulled or something like it. And it's not clear that that's the right picture for an Aristotelian or Ptolemaic thinker. The movements there seem to be caused by natural internal features of ethereal things rather than forces being imposed or impressed upon them. That doesn't end the discussion, right? Galileo's going to say, I don't care why it's moving. If it's moving, it's going to jostle other things. So the biggest celestial sphere, the one that includes the fixed stars, should be moving in interior spheres holding the planets, and the directions of the planets don't always accord with the directions in which the biggest celestial sphere moves. And so unless they're like meshed gears, which seems inappropriate for spheres, it's hard to account for that motion. We saw that objection made by Maimonides. So those are the main ingredients. I kind of mixed in the objections with the presentation of the argument, but that's in part because, despite Galileo's confidence, this is not an obviously cogent objection unless you can bring in some of the evidence from the telescope, like apparent mountains and craters on the moon, as some of you did. That directly helps bolster Galileo's position. Okay, I hope to have explained what went wrong with these. If you, upon serious consideration of my comments and the passage, do not understand why you got the grade you did, I encourage you to contact me. Thanks as always for your time and attention.